Okay, it is 6:05 Eastern. I think I'm going to get started. Thank you for those of you who are attending. I know there's a couple other really great trainings happening at the same time, which I highly encourage you to watch the recordings of those later. This training, we're going to cover 90 minutes of intensive mobile strategy, content, and some best practices. Just an intro for me. My name is Sandy Fox. I am the founder of Smartest Fox LLC. It's a digital strategy consulting firm that works with primarily nonprofits and political organizations in the progressive space. I've been consulting now for 4 years, but got my start in the political and nonprofit sector, working in-house for organizations like the Center for American Progress, Planned Parenthood, and on political campaigns like Deval Patrick for governor. So I've been in a lot of different roles, and I got my start doing texting with the Enough Project, and then started Planned Parenthood's texting program back in 2014. So I've been I've known in the space for my texting trainings and my work with nonprofit and political organizations with text organizing, fundraising, etc. So we're going to cover a lot today. Namely, we're going to cover first some basics, especially for those of you who've never been to any of my trainings. This is kind of some terminology that'll be helpful for you. Then we're going to dive into content, what works and what doesn't work for texting, and then best practices. And then we're going to dip into some compliance and deliverability. This is a shortened version of what I covered in my Netroots training earlier this month. Okay, so let's talk about some basics. First of all, one question. What do humans and goldfish have in common? Leah, if you want to answer in the chat, if you know, what do goldfish and humans have in common? If you've seen this before, a lot of folks have. No attention span. In fact, goldfish have a 1 second higher attention span than humans do, which is quite unfortunate. But this is why we use digital tools to keep people's attention. And mobile is one of those tool sets and channels that we really can benefit from using for our organizing and our outreach, as well as our fundraising and communication in general. So why mobile, right? First of all, as everyone knows already, almost everyone is on mobile. In fact, 96% of Americans own a mobile phone. That is only continuing to go up. I'm sure at some point we will actually hit 99 point something percent. And of those, over 90% own a smartphone. Now, that's about reaching people where they are, right? Everyone has a mobile device. And when we are trying to reach them, one of the key things with mobile is that they are actually reading all your messages. Unlike email, where things go into spam filters and they're, receiving dumps and dumps of email every day. And you get like an open rate maybe of, 14, 20, if you're really lucky, 30% of people reading your messages. We know from the carriers that actually 90% of those who get a text message will read it within 90 seconds of receiving it. So we know that they are actually reading your message and therefore are more likely to actually respond. And we have data to prove that they're more likely to respond because we find that on mobile, click-through rates as well as response rates are much higher and engagement rates than they are on email. In fact, they're 4% higher in terms of click-through rate for text messages over email. And it's engaging, unlike email or even some forms of social media where you're mostly talking at people. With texting, you're actually having a conversation and you can have that back and forth that you can't necessarily have on other platforms. It's also great for rapid response. When you're having one of those moments where you have to get information out quickly, right? A Supreme Court decision, your opponent in a race, says something that's really, really awful, that you need to react to, right? With other platforms or communications, right, you have to draft a press release, you have to draft the email, you have to go through a insane review process. It could take you an hour if you have a really fast process, right, to get it drafted up and out the door. But typically it can take a whole day or half a day to actually do that. With texting, you can get, it's 160 characters. You can get a message up and out and approved usually within less than an hour, if not shorter time periods, like half hour or even in minutes, depending on the type of organization structure you have. So again, it's about getting that information out quickly, and you can do that best when you're doing it via text message. It's also one of the best ways to reach communities of color and rural communities that have limited access to broadband. So these are communities we call smartphone dependent because they are really dependent on their mobile devices for access to communications and the internet. So when we talk about reaching people where they are, right, and using the preferred method of communication, this really does apply to communities of color because the Latinx community texts 1.56 times more than whites, and the Black community texts 2.24 times more than whites. So again, it's a preferred method of communication as opposed to, say, email or even the phone, or even calling. So again, it's about meeting people where they are on their preferred method of communication. So now let's talk about the difference between SMS and MMS. SMS is short for short message service. It's a text-based message that allows for links as well, and it's only 160 characters. Now, you can send longer messages, but these will be broken up into SMS segments, so they'll come as multiple messages. And while the carriers have gotten better at realizing that this is one message and making it appear as such, sometimes, depending on the phone and the carrier, the multiple segments might come jarbled in a different order. So if you send a long message that is more than 160 characters, that's 3 segments, you might have the message come in 3 different parts, and it'll be very confusing for the end user to actually, the person you're trying to reach, to read. So we try to avoid that. So we try to keep SMS messages short. Now, a lot of folks use MMS, which stands for Multimedia Message Service, to actually send longer messages that aren't broken up into those segments. But it also is mainly so that you can send images as well as GIFs to your supporters. This is great for different types of engagement. So if you're, for instance, doing a fundraising message to get folks to purchase a t-shirt or some sort of fulfillment ask, right, you can send them an image of that t-shirt. So there's a lot of different benefits, but the key thing to note is that MMS is 3 to 4, or actually 3 to 6 times more expensive than SMS, depending on the vendor that you are sending from. So, and most of the time, an SMS is 1 to 2 cents a message, whereas an MMS can be between 3 to 6 cents a message. Now, message delivery. How are my messages getting out there, right? First, we use a platform, but the person on the receiving end is getting it from a phone number. Now, there are 3 types of numbers that are used. There are long codes, also known as 10-digit long codes, 10 DLC. And it's a 10-digit local phone number, right? So this is like your typical phone number with the area code. And this is primarily used for one-on-one texting via an application or a person. But it has now been approved as long as you register through 10DLC requirements to actually be used for broadcast or bulk texting as well. Now, next is toll-free. A lot of you are familiar with those 1-800 or 866 numbers, right? And this can be used for either bulk mass texting or one-on-one texting via an application or person. And again, it's approved currently for bulk mass texting, which originally up until beginning of this year, long code wasn't. But it is slowly becoming clear what you can and cannot do on long code, and we're going to cover a little bit about that later. And then lastly, probably the one you're most familiar with is Shortcode. This is that 5 to 6 digit number that has been approved by all the phone carriers for bulk application to person texting, also known as broadcast texting. Now, shortcodes are the most expensive option, which is why they're not as frequently used by smaller organizations, but they are used by a lot of larger campaigns and national organizations. You've probably seen ads or social media or been at an event where they tell you to text vote to 66539, right? By texting that keyword, you're opting into their list. So the shortcode is really great for marketing purposes. It's easy to remember. It also is your own number that will be the only number used by your organization. No one else can use that number but you. Same with toll free if you have a specific number. And you can do large bulk texting with toll free now. Originally, speed of sending or the number of messages per second or per minute was the best with shortcode, which is another reason folks use shortcode. Toll free now offers different throughputs for texting. So you can send, a certain number of a higher number of messages per minute than you were formerly able to do, but you do pay an extra premium. So typically long codes and toll-free numbers are $1 to $3 per month. But if you do a higher throughput toll-free number, it can be as much as $300 a month. Whereas a short code, the cost ranges from $500 to $1,000 a month. So that's a key difference there. But again, they do have the highest throughput. So if you have a very large list that you have to continue messaging as part of your program, shortcode is probably the best way to go for you. Next is warm versus cold texting. So for warm texting, this is when you actually have a relationship with the person you're texting. These are your donors. These are your volunteers. These are your supporters, right? Folks who attend your events. These are folks who know your organization and most of the time have opted in and asked to receive text messages from you, right? So that's like warm versus hot texting, right? So warm texting is they know you and you're texting them without an opt-in, which we'll get into in a little bit, versus hot texting is they've confirmed that they want to receive messages and subscribe to receive messages from you. Now, cold texting is the opposite. It's like cold calling, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's when you are texting someone who is not familiar with your organization or campaign. And so they're probably less receptive to receiving messages from you. And this is typically what you're going to see when you're texting voters or when you purchase a list to text for some sort of civic engagement, right? These are just general population, sometimes targeted, right? Sometimes people who registered to vote recently, or people of color, or women between the ages of 18 and 34, right? Who most of them don't know who you are, don't know who your candidate is, don't know who your organization is. And so they're more likely to either opt out or lodge a complaint. So you need to make sure you are actually offering messaging that's important and helpful to them. Okay. Before I jump into peer-to-peer versus broadcast, does anyone have any questions? Apparently, we've got 17 people here, so feel free to add, while I'm talking, just feel free to add your name, your organization, and if you've ever taken a training with me before, into the chat. I see a few people might have joined us late. And also, at the end of each section, I will be asking if there are any questions. Okay? And I'm gonna go back. We're going to talk a little bit about peer-to-peer versus broadcast. So the first thing people tend to misconstrue when it comes to texting is that they assume that texting is best to people who are on the younger end of the spectrum. So Gen Z and millennials, maybe some Gen X, right? But not as much boomers. This is actually a misconception because, as I mentioned before, right, 96% of Americans have a mobile phone at this point, and the largest largest audience that is growing the fastest in terms of texting is actually boomers. So year over year, more and more boomers are texting, and this has to do with the fact that it's the best way for them to communicate with their grandchildren and children, especially after COVID. It's one of the best ways, along with obviously video chat and things like that, to be able to keep in touch with family members. So again, remember, this is a very personal medium. So when we're trying to decide whether we should be doing broadcast or peer-to-peer texting, the first thing we try to figure out is who our audiences are, who we're trying to reach. So are we reaching out to a specific district for a political campaign or ballot initiative, right? Let's talk about cold versus warm texting, right? Do I have a relationship with this audience already? What is that relationship? Are they volunteers? Are they voters, right? Do I already have a mobile opt-in, right? Have they already given consent to receive text from me, or is this a cold text or a warm text without an opt-in? What are my needs, right, for the campaign that I'm trying to run or the program I'm trying to run? So what are my goals? What am I trying to achieve? Am I going to try to organize a calling campaign or get people to a rally? Will there be rapid response moments? Am I using it for volunteer organizing, engagement, advocacy, fundraising, you name it, right? What are the things I'm going to be using this program for? Then what are my resources? Can someone, I'm going to go back. Can someone in the chat tell me what resources are that they'd be considering when they're deciding between broadcast or peer-to-peer texting? And it looks like Leah has a question. Do you recommend we ask people to opt in via Hustle? I'm actually going to get to that in a second. So keep watching. Any other questions or? Okay. So thanks, Leah. Yeah. So let's talk about the resources, right? First of all, people, right? How many people do you have to run your program, right? Do you have volunteers who can send one-on-one texts? Do you have staff with actual time on their hands to send those texts, right? Do you have, 2 staff members and a lot of volunteers? Do you have 10 staff members? Do you have 50, right? So that's your question. Do you have half a staff member who can dedicate their time to this? And then the next piece is time, right? Right? How much time can that person give? How much time can your organization give to actually getting these messages out, crafting these messages, and being strategic about it? And then lastly, money. Right? Depending on the size of your audience, unlike other different types of platforms, you actually have to pay per text message. And so that can get costly depending on the size of the list that you are texting. So we have to be aware of what our budget is. And also time is money, right? How much time of your staff can you take to actually get these messages out? So let's first talk about the platform itself, right? As we know, peer-to-peer is a one-to-one platform. And it's typically via the assistance of a mobile or web-based application. But a person has to press send on every single message. So if you're sending a message to 1,000 people, someone has to press send 1,000 times, right? And it's typically done using a long code or 10 DLC, though it could potentially be done via toll free depending on the platform you're using. Whereas broadcast is you're sending application to persons, right? You're sending one message out to thousands of people at once. So I press a button and that message will immediately go out to thousands or even millions of people with one press of a button. And it's typically done via shortcode or toll free. And you are approved by all the mobile carriers and go through a more rigorous process through toll free and shortcode to be approved for broadcast texting. Now, you can now do broadcast texting via a 10-digit long code, but there's new things in place, which I will get to in a little bit. Now, my tip to you is to beware of mobile tools that use something called snowshoeing, where they actually do broadcast texting from using 10 DLC or long codes. But what they do is they use multiple long codes to send 100 messages, 100 messages, 100 messages, and 100 messages in order to get around any restrictions for mass texting that exist. So snowshoeing is actually a big no-no from the carriers. They will block your messages from going out if you do this. They're basically playing Russian roulette with your list. You don't know if those messages are actually being received when you're using a broadcast application that does this. They call it throttling or with multiple numbers, but the term is called snowshoeing, and it's not allowed. So please be careful and make sure that whatever platform you do choose to use for broadcast texting isn't doing this, because sometimes your messages will not be received and blocked by the carriers, but you won't even know it. So maybe less than half your list is getting your messages and you're still paying for it. Capacity. So with peer-to-peer, you need multiple people, either staff or trained volunteers. So you're going to need your staff to train your volunteers, right? And each of these individuals is going to have to press send to send out thousands of messages in a certain time span. It usually takes about one person an hour to send around 1,000 messages. That can be increased depending on their experience using the platform and running and being a volunteer, a texter. Now, when we think about resources, right? So we know we need a lot more people to be able to send peer-to-peer messages, and they need time, right? Because we're going to need at least an hour to send 1,000 messages per person. If we have 50,000 messages to get out, right? How many people do we need versus how much time do we need to send those messages? And then money. We're going to get into this in a second because it's greatly changed over the last 2 years in terms of cost. But sometimes peer-to-peer texting can actually be more expensive than broadcast texting. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Now,
hey, Sandy,
yeah.
Just to let you know, we're just past the 30-minute mark.
Thank you for that. For broadcast texting, a single person can actually just schedule the message or send it immediately and send it out to thousands of people. So you really only need one person and probably a trained backup if they're on vacation or out sick. So that's your people, right? You need less time to be able to send those messages out, obviously, because it's more quick button. There's less training involved, etc. And depending on the platform, it can be more costly or less costly than peer-to-peer. So again, it's about the platform. Now, the key reason a lot of people use peer-to-peer versus broadcast is what I was talking about when we talked about cold versus warm texting. For peer-to-peer, it's technically not mandatory to have an opt-in, but some of the carriers are starting to make movements to say that it will be. And so we are still in negotiations about that. But for now, it's still not mandatory to receive an opt-in. And according to the government, it's not mandatory to get an opt-in to text using a peer-to-peer platform. So they're not subject to the same FCC and TCPA requirements, which we're going to get into in a little bit. And it's really great for cold texting, right? Now, broadcast, it's like your email program, right? It is mandatory for you to receive an opt-in to be able to send emails out. So you want them to subscribe. And you are subject to certain requirements in terms of how they're opted in, disclaimer language that you need to include. And you can get opt-ins via things like a web form or keyword opt-in, or even at an event or via canvassing. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways you can collect those opt-ins, which we'll get into. Now, my tip, and this goes to Leah's question, which is one of the great ways to actually collect broadcast opt-ins is by using peer-to-peer texting as an acquisition tool to get those opt-ins for a broadcast mobile list. So that I definitely suggest you consider doing. So in terms of cost, this has changed greatly since when peer-to-peer texting was introduced. Broadcast has been around since before 2008, but has been used since 2008 with political campaigns and nonprofits. But peer-to-peer only came on the scene in 2016. And at the beginning, the cost was basically 8 cents a text or 15 to 30 cents per contact on a monthly basis for unlimited texting. Now, some of the original peer-to-peer platforms still charge this much. That includes Through Text and as well as Hustle. But there has been a movement towards open source tools, and newer platforms have entered to be competitive. There are also different agreements in place with larger platforms that allow for certain organizations to get better rates. So now you can pay as little as 1 cent a text for peer-to-peer texting, depending on a couple different things, right? The platform, how big the list is that you're texting, so how many texts you're actually sending, quantity, right? All of those factors go into how much you're paying per message and what your overall cost is going to be. Broadcast is basically remaining the same, and it does vary by platform, but you can pay between 1 and 4 cents a message. Now, keep in mind, there is a possibility of paying less than 1 cent, but that is for very large campaigns that are sending millions of messages. Now, peer-to-peer has less time constraints usually. You can usually do a contract month by month or sign up for only a few months. Depending on the platform, a lot of the larger platforms that you might be more familiar with, like Mobile Commons, require a minimum annual contract. Not all do. Again, varies by platform. And remember that no list is the same. You really should do the math based on your list size, and also price hunt based on different platforms that are available. Now, functionality. Peer-to-peer offer more basic SMS and MMS functionality, right? You can do some personalization. Broadcast also offers that, but sometimes depending on the platform, you can also do more logic-based messaging. So it can be more conversational. If they reply yes, they get a message. If they reply no, they get another message. A lot of different platforms, including Action Network, Mobile Commons, etc., Strive, all offer this functionality. But there are plenty of broadcast platforms that do not. There are also a lot of peer-to-peer platforms that have restrictions in terms of the types of conversational messaging you can do. And again, really look into the platform in terms of functionality before you sign the dotted line and do your comparisons. Here's a good time for you to take a screenshot of the key differences. Feel free to, again, just take a screenshot so you have an easy reference. I'm going to leave this up for a sec so you can do that. And do we have any questions before we move on? Leah, can you also tell me how many folks do you see as participants? Apparently, you can see on your end, but we can't see on our end. I don't know why they did that. This platform's a little weird. So once again, let me know if you have any questions here. Take a screenshot. And then if someone could let me know in the chat how many participants we currently have. Great. Okay. So next we're going to talk about content. So some of you may be familiar with this because it applies to everything in terms of content creation, not just texting. But first step in that content implementation cycle is that you want to plan what your messages are for, right? What are you trying to accomplish? What do you want these messages to look like, right? Then we create or curate, right? We take, we will draft our message, or we'll take content from elsewhere and reuse it and turn that into a text message we're about to send. And then we distribute it, right? So then we send it out to our list. And then we evaluate how that content performed. And then we start our cycle again with any lessons we've learned from that last cycle that we did with another message. Now we're going to cover some of the basics of sending good messages. So number one is actually using a colloquial tone, right? And language. Can anyone tell me the differences between these three messages on the screen right now? Leah? Friend? No? Okay. I will share what the differences are. So you'll notice the bottom right says, Team Warren, can you host a house party for Elizabeth Warren's campaign? Reply yes for more information. It sounds very robotic, right? Very formal. This is kind of what we want to stay away from. Doesn't mean it's not effective. It's just less effective usually. It's definitely something I urge folks to test with their audiences, but at least what I found over the years that performs better is a little more of a conversational tone, a colloquial tone. So you'll notice we have, hi there, it's Sandy from Elizabeth Warren's campaign. I just wanted to see if you be interested in hosting a house party. Reply yes, learn more. And then we have the same message, but instead of reply yes, learn more, we have can you join us? ? So the key difference here are prompting a specific response or hoping they'll respond. So the second option with the can you join us is something we have tested against the reply yes with peer-to-peer texting. And we've actually found that reply yes has done better because it's given us or reply A, B, C, or D. We've actually done better in terms of getting the exact responses we want. But can you join us does sound a little bit more colloquial. So that's something I highly urge you to test on peer-to-peer. But for broadcast, if you're doing a logic-based response, you want to clearly tell them what word to use to respond. So reply yes or no, right? True or false, A, B, or C. Number two, this is what I call the 1/4 rule. 1/4 of your messages should be fundraising. or not, you don't even need to include fundraising, but if you want to include fundraising, it should never be more than 1/4, basically, for your messages. Now, I have different types here listed, action, where we ask you to take a survey, or an advocacy, sign a petition, announcements, and education. But really, the other 3/4 should be some sort of cultivation, right? And we typically, the best number of messages to send is usually between 2 and 4 a month, though a lot of organizations have started to send more. It's okay to send, depending on the circumstances, slightly more than 4 messages a month. But keep in mind, again, that this is a personal medium, and we don't want to inundate this new channel in the way that email has become just inundated with lots of messaging. Okay, number 3, personalize. With all platforms, you should be able to add a person's first name if you have it. So if you are uploading a list to send to and have their first name, we can include that information. We call it dynamic content, right? In a message. So, hi, Jen. Hi, first name. I just wanted to see if you'd be interested in hosting a house party. Reply yes to learn more. Hi, first name. Thanks for signing up to volunteer at blank event name, right? We are canvassing on Saturday in your area. Can you join us? Reply yes or no. So, right, if you're running, for instance, a series of events around the country for a national campaign, you can upload a list to match with their state or city. That includes the event name for their area, and we can insert that information in as well, right? So it's more personalized to those individuals. Next, number 4 is call and response, right? It's about that engagement we talked about before. Asking them a question, reply yes or no, right? Asking them a multiple choice question, like above, right? Are you registered to vote? And then you have a specific response ready depending on how they respond, right? Another really great thing for sending messages is collecting data. So, looking at your list, see how many people you have zip code information or first name or full name information for, and then sending a message asking them to reply with their name and email to sign a petition, right? And that way you can save that information to their profile. And depending on the platform, we also might have information based on, their zip code of who their elected official is. I know this is something you can do in a few platforms, primarily mobile comments, but I think Action Network also has this capability now as well. So again, it's about using that data to give a more personalized response, but also so you can do it in the future and save that data. Now, lastly, a little bit about that engagement. We talked about that question and answer, right? It's all about engagement flows, right? Asking a question, getting information, and then giving them a response based on their reply. And you can have multiple different flows. They can go down A, B, or C, right? And then C can go A and B split. And these are engagement or logic based flows that you can do in both a peer to peer or broadcast platform. Not all broadcast platforms will allow you to do this. And also, not all peer to peer platforms will allow you to do this necessarily to the extent that you might want to. So it's about looking into that functionality, but this adds to your program at a very high level in terms of that engagement and how you can really involve your supporters in your organization or campaign. Okay, any questions from that before we move on to best practices? Okay. Hearing none, moving on to best practices. So, first of all, let's talk about the pieces of the mobile puzzle when it comes to strategy, right? So, first of all, quality content. This is content that your supporters or the people you're texting are going to want to interact with, right? You're providing them with a piece of information or content that they want to engage with, right? So either you're giving them their polling location, or you are sharing a quiz that they might want to take, right? Or giving them important information about a Supreme Court decision or a piece of legislation, right? You want to make sure that it is good content that they're going to want to interact with. And you want to make sure that whatever you are doing on mobile is fully integrated with your organizational strategy. So you're also sending an email similar. You're doing social media on this, right? It's really one of the things that I've seen time and time again with mobile programs is that it's siloed and forgotten about. It's like that the ugly stepchild, right? Who is just kind of left to the side because no one is like reminding people that we need to do something. As the person at a new organization when I started, I was that person who was like, hey, we need to do something on mobile for this too, right? You need to have that cheerleader within your organization to spearhead ensuring that mobile is fully integrated with everything else that you are doing on digital, but also within your other departments as well. Authenticity, right? That personalization and that colloquial tone actually ensure that you have an authentic voice and that you come across your users as trustworthy and someone that they want to engage with. Also, targeted engagement, right? Segmentation, right? I'm not going to send an invitation to an event in New York to someone who lives in California, right? Making sure you're targeting folks who are interested in the content you're receiving, or based on their age or any other information, or gender based on geography, etc. Segmentation, just like with any email program, is really key to ensuring that your content is actually quality to the audience that's receiving it. Then we want to look at our data and analytics, right? We want to see how people are engaging. We want to do testing based on that data, right? We want to experiment and see what works and what doesn't work. A lot of the best content practices I mentioned before were tested with multiple organizations and different lists, which is why I suggest them. But doesn't mean you shouldn't test it with your own audience, because every audience is different and you are not your audience. So you can't make assumptions about them. So let's talk about a couple of list growth. So a lot of folks really only know about peer-to-peer texting because it blew up and a lot more organizations started using it before they even knew about broadcast texting. So with peer-to-peer texting, you're texting a cold list. So you're literally just purchasing a list or getting a list from a voter file and texting it. So you don't have to think about list growth. Whereas with broadcast, you need to collect those opt-ins. And folks always like, can I actually do that? Yes, it's very easy to collect opt-ins. And one of the ways that folks do it is making sure that you have the mobile opt-in disclaimer language on all forms. Most organizations already have an email disclaimer saying that if you provide your email, you're agreeing to receive emails from that organization. There is mobile language that is specific that you include in this right under your mobile field, right? So that folks know that they're opting in. And that way you're getting a lot more opt-ins. In fact, this is the highest level of opt-ins that you can use. A lot of people think keywords actually generate more opt-ins. That is not the case. It is your regular forms. When I worked with the Georgia Democratic Party, we got about maybe 3,000 opt-ins from events and keywords, but we got 10,000 opt-ins from their forms. So this is an example of a calling campaign form, right? We asked for phone number, and then under the call me button is this opt-in language. right? We have the email update opt-in, and then we have by providing my cell phone number, I agree to receive calls and texts that to that number from Planned Parenthood organizations that may be automatically dialed or pre-recorded with information on Planned Parenthood issues. We have our message and data rates may apply, text stop to opt out, help for more info, no purchase necessary. And now we usually say recurring messages or periodic messages. And then we also have our terms and conditions or privacy policy. So this is that legal language that we were talking about before, which I'm going to get into in a little bit. Next, rapid response moments, right? Something big is happening. On the right, you can see a perfect example of this. Unfortunately, with every mass shooting that we had, every Town for Gun Safety would put out an ad that says, join us by texting enough to 64433. And they would get a ton of opt-ins from folks who are just simply outraged, as they should be, from the number of mass shootings that occur in this country on a weekly, monthly, and annual basis. Okay, so using those moments to get folks to opt in using either forms or keywords. Event call to action with an opt-in. Here's an example of Kamala running for president. This was her announcement speech when she first announced she was. You'll notice on the podium that was live streamed, but also on big screens outside for people to see, was text fearless to 70785, right? This is a perfect way for you to get folks to opt in. I've seen this on posters at rallies where people were handing out posters and everyone was holding them up, and it would have the keyword opt in on those posters. Social media, right? This is an example of a Facebook banner that was put up on the day of the Hobby Lobby decision. If those of you are unfamiliar, this was like a birth control decision that said that different organizations could refuse to cover birth control for their employees and health insurance. And we joined Ruth Bader Ginsburg's dissent, and we asked people to text dissent to 69866, right? So again, and we also had graphics that were on Twitter and all the different places as well. And then paid ads, right? This is an example of No Kid Hungry, right? They do a huge summer meal program. And this is not an opt-in actually, but it could be. They ask people to text food to their short code to find out where they can get a summer meal based on their address. And keyword opt-ins are also really great on TV and radio, as well as print. All right, so best practices. Always identify your organization. This is required and will ensure that you're not complained on by the folks you're texting, especially for peer-to-peer texting without an opt-in, but also for broadcast texting. You must include your name as an organization so they know who they're receiving text from. This could be a short acronym. You notice it says PP Action in the text on the right. Or you could say, hi, it's Sandy from so-and-so organization, right? Make it personal. Note that, again, I'm signing off as Sandy at PP Action. You could also just sign as PP Action. But we found in testing with a lot of different organizations that having a name associated, a person's name associated with the text they're receiving, actually encourage them to act more likely respond to those text messages. Engage your list. This is an example of the Human Rights Campaign after the marriage equality decision came down, right? Ahead of it, they asked folks to text marriage to their short code. And once the decision came down, anyone who had texted marriage were the first people to hear the information about the decision via text message. This was a similar tactic that was used by the Obama campaign in 2008 to announce that Biden was their VP pick at the national convention. They asked people to text VP to their shortcode. And then on the day they announced, they texted anyone who had texted that keyword and told them it was Biden. Now, a lot of campaign staffers actually, the only way they knew was through the same method. They didn't tell their staff first. They actually informed them the same exact way that anyone else who opted in did. Next, make it exclusive and fun, right? Maybe texting a keyword will get them a fun screensaver for their phone, right? And then KISS, keep it short and simple. Remember, with SMS, you only have 160 characters, but you also have to remember folks have even like less of an attention span than they did in the 10 years before now, right? Our attention spans are unfortunately shrinking. So shorter is better. So even if you're doing an MMS where you can have unlimited characters, right? You still want to keep it, bite size. Even if you can go over 160 characters, you don't want too long of a message. I've unfortunately seen some campaigns really copy and paste an email into a text message. I do not advise this. Okay. For broadcasts, best use cases include announcements like rapid response, advocacy, using it for petition signatures. Some tools have click to call built into their platform. One example of that is Mobile Commons, another is Action Network. Events, right? Using broadcasts to both advertise events and get RSVPs, but also to promote opt-ins at events. Educational surveys and quizzes, right? Learning more about your audience with a survey, but also giving them a fun way to test their knowledge on, their labor rights if it's a union. Using it for fundraising, right? There's a lot of different ways we can use texting to fundraise for year end, for Giving Tuesday. And then also acquisition, right? Using those keywords to actually get more folks opted in to your list. Peer-to-peer best use cases, voter engagement, right? Using it for persuasion to introduce them to your candidate. So letting them know that your candidate is running for office and giving them information about them, IDing voters to see if they're going to support your candidate. And then lastly, GOTV. We tend to see more of texting being used in the GOTV stage, but that doesn't mean we can't use it in the earlier stages as well. Fundraising. It's really great for lapsed donor outreach. These are folks who obviously are warm, right? They're your donors, but they might have forgotten to give you an updated credit card if they were a sustainer, right? So a great way to do outreach is to send them a peer-to-peer text and say, hey, I don't know if you know this, but your credit card expired and we just need an updated credit card for your file to continue your monthly giving, and then send them a link. Tech center, sort of like telemarketing, right? So you can do that kind of outreach by hiring a telemarketing firm to do that kind of cold outreach as well. Or to just folks who've never given. And then acquisition to your broadcast mobile list, which we talked about before. So important things to remember. First of all, action comes from regular, varied two-way communications. When I say regular, I mean text them often enough that they're used to hearing from you. Don't go months without sending a text because people will forget they are on your list, and then they'll be more likely to opt out. So this applies mostly to broadcast texting, but can apply to peer-to-peer as well around election time. Varied. Don't always ask them for the same thing. The 1/4 rule, right? Don't send 3 fundraising messages and one random announcement message, right? Make sure that it's a mix of different types of tactics and different types of content, okay? And when we say regular, again, the best practice is 2 to 4 messages a month. Please do not send more than 1 message a week if you can avoid it. I'll show you some examples, unfortunately, later of too many messages. And also remember, this is two-way communication, right? It's a conversation. Make it one. Engage, ask questions, have that conversational back and forth. So 5 text messaging mistakes to avoid. Number 1, no clickable link. So you'll notice this is a text from NARAL, and they have a sign off and saying it's from NARAL after the link, and you can see the link on the screen. This is what happens on iPhones, though I've seen in some updates this has been fixed, but not in all iPhones, so beware. But if you don't put any characters after your link in the message, this tap to load preview button will appear. And then that means that a person needs to press that little box and then press the link again after that. It's a barrier to engagement and conversion. So don't do that. Less people are likely to click on your link if you don't put a character after it, because they won't be able to see it as easily. Not identifying your organization. I mentioned this earlier. Always, always identify your organization. This is unfortunately an example of someone who is on a shared shortcode, which makes it even worse. Though shared shortcodes are being phased out. They still currently exist if you were grandfathered in, but soon they will be completely banned. There are no new shared shortcodes that are existing, and people are being moved off shared shortcodes as I speak. So you always have to say who you are. Otherwise, someone is going to report you and the shortcode, or the toll-free number or the local number, and a complaint will be lodged, and you'll be more likely to be penalized for sending those messages. Too many messages. So it's hilarious because I thought this was a lot at the beginning of 2020 when I got multiple messages from Kamala in a row, most of which, by the way, were fundraising asks. And I thought this was a lot to receive in 1 month, right? But then when Biden became the nominee, I would get a message or more a day. And this was from a broadcast program. And I'm sorry, that is too many messages. You might be fundraising a decent amount, and that might be your end goal, but you're burning through your list. And you want to make sure that you're actually able to engage them in other ways during the campaign, but also after the campaign to utilize for other things. Too many campaigns turn and burn their email list, and even more, and now as well, their mobile lists. Please do not do this. You still can make more money via email than you can on text, and text is a very personal medium, and they're just gonna stop looking at your message, even if they don't opt out, which, you're still gonna have higher opt-outs for sure, but maybe not as many as you expect. They're just not reading your messages. So when you actually send a message asking people to volunteer, they're ignoring it because they think it's another fundraising ask. Okay? So don't do that.
Hey, Sandy, you're at your second 30-minute mark.
Thank you very much. Next, not engaging. So I mentioned before that at different events, people would hand out posters and some had opt-ins. The first time I saw this was actually at a rally, and the DNC had posters made up that they handed out for folks to hold. And on it was a DNC opt-in. So I did it, and immediately I got this: say you're in to elect Democrats, sign up here. and they just sent me to a link. What they could have done was, welcome to be thank you for opting in to the Democratic Mobile network. Please reply with your email address, right? And they could have collected the email just via text. I'm less likely to click on that link than I am to actually, provide information via text. Then they could have asked me for my zip code, right? And then they could have said, we'll be in touch. Thanks so much for joining us at, this rally or something. But they didn't do that. So this is a non-engaging message. Sending folks to a non-responsive landing page. This is one of my favorites. This is from 2017. And so don't worry, they fixed this. But I think what makes it even funnier is that this was actually done by Hustle. So I received this text message asking me to sign up with a link to join the Hustle texting team. And I clicked on the link, and this was the landing page I got to on mobile. You'll notice I can't even see the full field to fill out the forms. It's completely non-responsive, and for Hustle to have a non-responsive sign-up page is kind of hilarious but sad. But again, 2017. But don't do this. Make sure that anything you are linking to via text is either a mobile-friendly or responsive page. Okay. Lastly, honorable mention. And this is like a big no-no, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it later. But if someone texts stop, the platform you're using should immediately opt them out. If it doesn't, you are likely to get fined by the FCC and could potentially also get fined by the carriers now. This is Julian Castro, right? Someone texted stop, and then his campaign continued to text them and the platform didn't opt them out, or the individual texting via a program, right, via a peer-to-peer platform didn't opt them out. So actually honoring opt-out requests, please do that. This is another honorable mention from the Julian Castro's campaign. Remember I mentioned before about people cutting and pasting an email? He's not the only one who did it, but I actually have the evidence of it here. This is awful. Please don't do this. Okay, now let's talk about compliance. This is where mobile gets even trickier. And so we only have 30 minutes to cover this, and I'm going to go fairly quickly, but know that I do full trainings that are an hour that cover all of this. So let's first talk about the two different enforcement mechanisms in place for compliance. First, we have the Telephone Consumer Protection Act that is enforced by the FCC. The TCPA is a statute that was passed in 1991 that is in dire need of updates and will most likely be updated in the next 10 years, if not sooner. This is mainly to restrict telemarketing and spam via voice, SMS, and fax. So the FCC has enforced this regulation. Meanwhile, the CTIA, oops, sorry. That's my co-presenter, Olive, who is a little excited. So I apologize for that. It's okay, cutie. And then the CTIA is the non-governmental enforcing body, which is basically the trade association for every wireless carrier in the US. So T-Mobile, AT&T, Verizon, they are all members of the CTIA, and the CTIA speaks for them. And they help release statements on enforcement for the carriers. Now, oops, sorry. The key here is that what I used to say in the past is that The FCC can fine you if you do something wrong with compliance, whereas the CTIA can just completely block you from sending messages if you don't follow the rules. But now the carriers are starting to institute possible fines as well. So there might not be legal action, but they can fine you. Now, these are a couple of the key decisions that have come down over the last couple years that have set up where we stand right now when it comes to the FCC and the TCPA in terms of enforcement of texting. So first of all, in the summer of 2020, the FCC released a ruling on ATDS, which stands for Automatic Telephone Dialing Systems. And they decided that the peer-to-peer platforms that we use regularly, like Spoke, Hustle, etc., right? These platforms are not considered automatic telephone dialing systems and are therefore not held to the TCPA. So one of those key things is not requiring an opt-in, right? If they were held to the TCPA, an opt-in would have been required. The next decision came down this spring, and it was Facebook versus Do Good. And this one kind of blew up a lot of things, which will likely be the reason why the TCPA is going to get redone in the next, hopefully, few years. But right now, it kind of blew up a lot of the FCC's enforcement because Facebook versus Do Good declared that the TCPA only applies to telephone dialing systems that fall under the 1991 definition of what an automatic telephone dialing system is. Now, our platforms are built completely differently, nearly 30 years later. They don't look in any way like an ATDS from 1991, which means that pretty much no platform is considered an auto dialer according to the TCPA and then the FCC. So this has kind of spiraled, but this does not mean you should be mass texting without an opt-in. You should still be a good actor. There's also enforcement being done by the carriers who don't want you to be texting without an opt-in. So just know that that case came down. Now, the case that allows the carriers to actually do enforcement and filter messages and fine was a decision in 2018 where the FCC decided that texting is not considered a telecommunications service in the way that phone calls are, which would have meant that they could not in any way restrict those communications. Instead, they decided that texting is considered information services. And what that means is that they can filter, they can block, and they can fine with regards to texting. Now, a key thing to note is that we, as well as the FCC and the carriers, all use different terminology that sounds similar or is similar with different wording, and it can get very confusing. So first off, I mentioned before that the FCC bases, say hi to Olive, that the FCC bases all their decisions on whether or not a platform is an automatic telephone dialing system, right? So if they are, then the FCC will enforce it. If they aren't, they will not. So similar to the FCC, all of our organizations on the progressive side, but also on the non-progressive side, anyone in the nonprofit political realm, right, define broadcast texting as an ATDS, right? Automatic telephone dialing system, and P2P as a non-ATDS, right? Because it's an individual pressing send every time, right? So that's why broadcast requires an opt-in and peer-to-peer does not. But the carriers don't look at it that way. They don't look at it in terms of the system that's sending the messages. They look at it in terms of who is sending the messages, right? So if it is an organization sending the messages, no matter if it's pressing send on every message, if it's a campaign or a nonprofit or a company, it's considered application to person. And those messages, if they're going out to one individual or multiple individuals, it's still application to person. They refer to P2P, peer-to-peer, as an individual texting another individual. So we don't view P2P as in the same way that the carriers view P2P. And this has caused a lot of confusion with more recent rules that have come down, which we're going to talk about. So the CTIA basically decided that they were going to tighten their reins due to a ton of consumer complaints that came in 2020. And that was due to a lot of reasons, right? A lot more companies and a lot more organizations around the election and census were texting because people couldn't go into stores anymore, and people couldn't go door to door for organizing purposes because of the pandemic. So texting increased tenfold. And they decided that they were going to further enforce and block folks who did not actually provide consent to text, who do not provide clear opt-out language in all their outgoing texts, used any public domain short URL, so bit.ly or any that you could just go on the web and create a short URL yourself. Any of those were more likely to be blocked. And then lastly, what I mentioned earlier in this training is snowshoeing, which was when you use multiple numbers in different quantities to send to like 100 people using this number, 100 people using that number, right? To overcome what they're filtering for spam, right? If they catch you doing this, they're more likely to fine you or block your messages. So these were the first step that the carriers released in the fall of 2020. And that led to what we are now seeing with the new 10 DLC rules. So basically, yes.
There's a 15-minute warning for you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So 10 DLC, the key things to note is that, again, this was a response to holding organizations accountable for being bad actors in the space. And they decided that they would require that any organization texting from a long code or regular phone number would have to register. Now, the key thing with this is that only two carriers are enforcing this, T-Mobile and AT&T. Verizon released their own 10 DLC rules in 2020, and it didn't change any way about how we're texting. Whereas if you want to text any numbers that are T-Mobile or AT&T, which everyone has on their lists, you must register your brand or organization for what they call application to person texting, meaning any messages being sent either one-on-one or bulk texting from a 10-digit long code. We're still engaging on whether opt-ins are going to be required or not. And they have an entity they've created called the campaign registry, where you have to register. And if you're a political campaign, you don't just have to register with the campaign registry, but you have to be vetted first by the campaign verify. and receive a token that you then submit to the campaign registry with your regular registration. Okay, we talked about this. We can skip that. So when you register, first you register your organization or brand. That's a $4 one-time fee. Then you have to include your use cases. You can choose 1 to 5. Most organizations who are getting this training right now are going to be considered a charity or political. So you're going to be under special use cases. Now, political campaigns are going to have to get verified. There's a $95 fee associated with that. Once you verify, you submit that with your brand registration. Now, everyone gets a verification score, which decides how many messages you can send per minute and per day for each carrier. And then after that, you have a campaign registration, which for charities is $5 per month, and for political is $10 per month. Now, we're working on getting the charity for 501c3s actually waived, so it might be $0. But if you're running a 3-month campaign, you're paying a $10 fee per month, so $30 for that campaign under your brand. Now, T-Mobile was about to introduce another fee that was $50 one time per campaign, but they postponed that. So in the case of the example I gave before, if that was in place, it would have been $80 instead of $30 to launch one text messaging campaign. Now, you're probably asking, what if I just don't register? So some of these are already in place, others are not. There will be, and this got postponed, I believe, till November now, higher network messaging fees. So if you don't register, you're going to pay double the fee per message. That's a carrier fee. So you're paying your per message fee and then your carrier fee on top of that. And that fee is going to double. So you'll be paying more per text if you're not registered. Then they don't have the mechanisms yet in place as far as I've been told. But if you aren't registered, they could potentially simply just block your messages from going through. And then lastly, they have fines that they're saying are going to be put in place, some of which already are in place. So don't be a bad actor, right? We had this example from Julian Castro of texting after someone asked to opt out. The Trump campaign has also done this, and they have had multiple lawsuits filed against them. And also, they have had multiple lawsuits filed against them for texting without consent. They've broadcast texted a list without receiving consent to text those individuals. And there's actually 5 new TCPA lawsuits that were filed in March of this year against a combination of GOP committees, PACs, and candidates. But I want to use Julian, unfortunately, as a shining example that it's not just Republicans who are bad actors in this case. There are also progressives, Democrats, nonprofits who have done the same. Now, a key thing to note when it comes to this is express written consent, right? This is the consent that is required when it comes to broadcast texting. It could become required for peer-to-peer texting. This is still very much up in the air. Right now, implied consent is being used for peer-to-peer texting. Basically, with a voter file, it's implied consent because you're texting them about the election and they are a voter, right? So compliance 101. Number 1, get express consent, especially if you are doing broadcast texting. Always identify your organization. Include the legal disclaimer language for all opt-in requests, so on your forms, and if you use a keyword opt-in, always include stop to quit language. For broadcasts, it's now required to be in every text you send. For peer-to-peer, it's strongly encouraged, though in testing, we haven't seen any filtering yet. Doesn't mean it won't happen. And it does lead to higher opt-out rates. But think about it this way. It's folks you probably don't want to be messaging because they don't want to be on your list. Respect opt-out requests and don't spam. Basically, make sure that you are offering a value proposition to your supporters. If it is valuable to them, they will not consider it spam and report it. Okay. Really quick with deliverability, right? Just like email, right? It's the number of messages received compared to the number of messages sent. Deliverability can be very different depending on the carrier. So you could send a message and all of the messages go through to Verizon. None of the messages go through to AT&T. You can see here are a couple examples, right, of different message campaigns that have gone out where the deliverability across the carriers range and they're varied. These are horrible delivery rates. You want to have at least 90% or higher for your peer-to-peer delivery rate, and it should be closer to 100% for broadcast. There's no reason for broadcast that not your messages aren't going through unless you have some bad numbers on your list. Okay.
Excuse me, Sandy, you got 5 minutes?
Okay.
Thanks.
I'm going to jump from here to questions for folks. Basically, I want you to understand the process first of where how text messages get through. So first, the text message platform sends those messages through you, right? And they will go to what's called a aggregator or a cloud service provider. That could be Twilio, Ytel, Open Market, Bandwidth, etc. Then they use a service called Cineverse that breaks up those messages by carrier and shoots them over. Then each carrier will send them down one of several different pathways. And you'll notice I have a little block on the different pathways. These are what I call the highways, and every different type of texting receives a lane. Shortcode texting, toll-free texting, 10DLC texting, and what they consider peer-to-peer, which is individual texting. Now, when you are texting down that peer-to-peer lane, right, only this lane has what are considered A to P filters, meaning if you are texting the same message out to multiple people, you are likely to have that message blocked because you're sending more than one message out, right? So if you use broadcast texting on that P2P lane, right, and you're not because you're not registered, then basically think of it as a toll on your lane. There is a toll that you're going to hit for A to P, and you won't be let through. Then we have spam filters. Spam filters exist in the 10DLC and the toll-free lanes, but not in the shortcode lane. And spam filters are similar to email filters, but not, because unlike email, which goes into a spam folder, your messages are just completely blocked. But similar to email, every carrier has a different algorithm, and every carrier changes that algorithm all the time. Okay? I'm going to go through this real quick. So how do I improve my message deliverability? Number 1, provide a good user experience. Number 2, always identify your organization. And keep in mind how your message is formatted and written, because that will encourage whether or not you're highlighted as spam. No public short URLs, i.e. bit.lys. You can actually really easily purchase a short domain using something like Rebrandly. Variations of content. So if you're sending a similar message using P2P out to multiple folks, right, do slight variations in the content and rotate that through. Always provide clear opt-out instructions. Something, again, on peer-to-peer I suggest you test, which isn't currently fully being enforced, but might be. And for A2P traffic, always make sure you're registered for your long code, toll-free, or short code. Okay. And then lastly, monitor. If you see your deliverability rate is is going down or lower than it should be, stop your messages from going through and reconsider your message content, and then redo it to the folks who didn't get the message before. So again, halt your campaign, reevaluate, and then start it up again. Okay, we're not going to play the game because we don't have time, but I am going to ask if folks have any questions. Okay, we are at the end. If you have a question, please put it in the chat box. Happy to answer. If not, I wish you all a wonderful evening, and thanks for joining me. I'll stay on for just a little bit more in case folks have some questions. And Leah, to your earlier question, if you are doing an opt-in via Hustle or any other peer-to-peer platform, please remember to include the proper opt-in language when you're asking them to opt in. So including, the standard data and message rates may apply, stop to quit, help for info, and a privacy policy link that includes more information, which you need to also have in your privacy policy. Happy to have a separate conversation with you about that. But you need to have specific language to do proper mobile opt-in acquisition. Okay. Well, if anyone does have any questions, my email is on the screen. So feel free to email me at standy at smartasafox.org. And I'm happy to speak with you one-on-one. And have a good night, everyone. I think we're going to shut this down and let everyone enjoy the rest of their evenings.